All right. Well, good morning and thank you for being with us. I am here today interviewing Frederick John Rosenthal, who is a Ritchie Boy and a graduate of the 15 class. So, good morning. How are you?
Good morning.
I am fine, thank you.
Good. Now, would you like to go by Frederick or John?
John,
John. Okay. Now, John, do you mind sharing how old you are?
How old you are?
I am 99 plus years.
Well, congratulations on your longevity. Um,
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your service to the country. And again, we're just so thrilled to have a conversation with a Ritchie Boy today. So the first question I have for you, if you're ready for the interview, is
Ready for the interview.
Hmm?
Ready for the interview.
Yes, I am.
and I'd also like to share with those viewers who watch us. John is joined by his daughter Judith, who is helping out today. So, John, my first question is, can you tell us a little bit about your experience growing up in Europe?
Can you tell a little bit about your experience growing up in Europe?
Well, I grew up in Europe until I was 15 years old, and it was a typical Jewish boy in a Nazi country. Uh, it was not pleasant. Uh, there were boys calling me names, throwing stones, but my parents sent me out of the country to relatives in Holland and then to Belgium to keep me from the worst experiences. But uh, I couldn't go to public baths. I couldn't go to the movies. But fortunately, in Cologne, where I grew up, there was a Jewish high school. So that sort of balanced things. But for a young boy, I didn't experience the worst. During Kristallnacht, my family was hiding out in the top floor of our apartment building for about 3 days. So I was aware of the conditions and also what we were in for. I was always interested in international affairs, so I kept up to date by looking at the newspaper. And one thing I do remember is one time in 1938 or 39, my brother came home with a pistol, and we were all very shocked at this. And he got punished by my father, but that that was how I was aware of the dangers in which we lived. That's about basically, yeah.
Sure. So, things were getting tense in Europe. And then, can you tell us a little bit about how you found yourself coming to the United States?
How did you find yourself coming into the United States?
Meaning what? How did I find myself?
How did you get to the United States?
Oh,
And
uh, my father had a school friend from his going to college. And this man, this friend, was a lawyer in New York City. And when it came time to emigrate, my father sent him a letter asking, would he give an affidavit for us? And the reply came back, glad to help. Alphonse, glad to help. And that was it. We traveled to Stuttgart to the consulate, and there we got our visa. And we also got a passport from the German government in which my name, John, was changed to Johann, the German equivalent, which was really not my name, but it said Fritz Johann Rosenthal. And there was a big fat red J in the passport. I gave it to my daughter Judith. She's family historian, and she keeps hold of that passport.
Good.
With that passport, we were able to leave Germany well ahead of the big disaster. It was after Kristallnacht, but before the big curtain came down. And
Was
so
your whole family able to get out?
the whole family, my father, my mother, my brother, and I, yes,
Good.
all together.
What about England?
Huh?
On your way?
Huh?
How did you get from Germany
Oh,
to New York?
We traveled by train to the Netherlands, where we were taken by a family that belonged to an organization to provide shelter for refugees till they were able to go on from there. So we stayed in Holland for about a month, maybe, while my parents, who had friends in Switzerland, took the opportunity of visiting them for about a month, while my brother and I stayed with this family in Holland, where I learned how to play chess, listened to nice music, and sort of let down after all the hectic experiences before getting ready for the trip by boat to New York.
Okay. When you got to New York, were you able to switch your name back to Frederick John?
When you got to New York, were you able to switch your name back to Frederick John?
In Cologne, it was always Fritz, in Fritzchen, the diminutive. When I got to New York, it became my middle name, John, and it's been John ever since.
Now, when you arrived in the United States, what did you and your family begin to do as far as work and school are concerned?
When you arrived in New York, what did you and the family do as far as work and school?
Okay. My mother was a designer of knitted garments. And so when she got to New York, she employed other refugees to do some of the clothes making, knitting. Knitting was an accepted occupation for women in their spare time. And my mother designed knitted dresses, employed about 30 to 40 other refugee women who knitted clothes to my mother's design. As far as school was concerned, that was a real, well, adventure. First, I was sent to the uh, High School of Commerce in New York City. I was able to speak English, but I was taught the Queen's English in Cologne. So when I got to New York and I spoke, the kids looked at me in a funny way. And it took quite a while for me to get accustomed to speak New Yorkese or American English. And the topics in the high school were completely strange to me. One thing I remember, there was a class called music appreciation. And the thing that they were teaching at that time was a song, I dream of Jeannie with the light brown hair. So that was my introduction to New York High School music lecture. Another thing was when I came, I was dressed in the European manner with short pants rather than long pants, which teenagers used to wear in the US. So there are two things I changed in a hurry, great hurry. One was to wear long pants, and the other to drop the Queen's English and adopt American idioms. From the High School of Commerce, I was sent to the George Washington High School in uptown New York City, which didn't last very long because my parents thought I ought to learn a trade. So I was enrolled in the food trades vocational high school. That was my third school in New York City within a year, I think it was. And I learned how to make uh, tuna salad and things like that in the food trades vocational high school. It was a long ride from uptown New York City, Washington Heights, where we settled, to downtown 14th Street to the high school. So twice a day, I traveled on the subway for a long time.
Wow. Huh. And
That's
so, upon completion of school, were you drafted or enlisted into the Army?
Upon completion of school, were you drafted or enlisted in the Army?
Oh, in 1941, when Japan attacked the United States, I was in a Chinese restaurant, Midtown Manhattan. I heard the news. So I was prepared for military service, but it was not until 1943 that I was called before the draft board, and thereby hangs a tale. My mother was insistent that I tell the draft board that I had polio earlier, which I did when I was 12 or 13. I had polio and my leg, so the muscles shriveled, were atrophied. And I felt my mother was concerned for my life, that I shouldn't be drafted. But I felt that that I owe that I owed this country my service. So I told the draft board I did have polio, but I got over it. My father massaged my leg every night. They tried electric, they tried hydro, but what really put me back on my feet was my father's night massage. So I told all this to the draft board. They accepted me, and I was drafted in 1943, became a member of the U.S. Army.
It's quite moving to see how meaningful that experience was for you.
It's quite moving to see how meaningful that experience was
Yeah.
for you.
So when you were at first drafted, what was the first installation you were placed at?
I was sent to Fort Dix in New Jersey, and from there I was sent for basic training to a place not far from where I live now. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, and about an hour and a half drive, you get to Spartanburg, South Carolina. And in Spartanburg, South Carolina, there was a basic infantry training camp called Camp Croft, Croft, where I received basic infantry training. And that was chiggers, red clay, heat, and long marches with 60-pound back, hand to hand combat training. And even there, anti Semitism was following me. There were some kids from New Jersey who called me names, and I fought with them. But as I was a city boy and they were street boys, I didn't make it ever. I always was on the losing part, but I had to stand up for what I was and for what I believed. So that was part of that. In how far do you want me to go with my military?
Well, as far as you'd like.
Huh?
As far as you'd like.
Okay. Oh, yes. I said I was in South Carolina, Camp Croft, very close to Asheville, about an hour and a half drive. So that is maybe fate. But in they sent me to the ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program, because I spoke a foreign language. I came from a foreign country. So the army, in its wisdom, thought that I might benefit from training in German area studies. What they did in the ASTP, they sent me to Minneapolis, where I was assigned to the university, and the German area studies. As far as I was concerned, I didn't learn much. I mostly went to a great hall where I sat and listened to the Minneapolis Orchestra. Beautiful music. And uh, it was a sort of a vacation after infantry basic training. I stayed there for a fairly long time in the ASTP, and I sort of felt, what am I doing here? I'm supposed to be drafted in the army, and the army is a fighting outfit to fight the Germans. What am I doing here at the University of Minnesota? So, not long after, the army decided, rather than area studies, they would make use of my language abilities. I not only spoke German, but I went to school in the Netherlands, Holland, spoke Dutch like a native, and so I actually had two languages. And so I guess you know what's coming next. Camp Ritchie. They sent me to Ritchie to make use of my linguistic abilities and train me in military intelligence. So I wound up at Camp Ritchie.
Do you remember how you learned that you were going to be sent to Camp Ritchie?
No, I don't remember the details. All I remember is that I was glad to be finally doing something useful for this country.
What do you remember about your time at Camp Ritchie?
What do you remember about your time at Camp Ritchie?
My time, first of all, my time at Ritchie was rather limited. I never completed the full course of intelligence training. The boss of the camp was the Colonel Banfield, or Banfield. He made life tough for us. There was never a calendar week. There was always one extra day attached, which we called Band Day. And so rather than giving me the full course of training, I was pulled about halfway through before I could get the full intelligence training. For example, I was never trained to interrogate prisoners of war, just the minimum. And I was trained in making maps, in field orientation, in photo interpretation of aerial photographs, and so on and so on. But we felt Colonel Banfield wanted to get an extra star or get a star. So he wanted to really produce intelligence teams, which was why my training was cut short so that he could send teams to Europe and get a meritorious recognition for this production. Uh, Actually, I enjoyed my stay at Ritchie because I was interested in making maps, in photo interpretation, and uh, one funny thing is I was detailed for a while to be the fireman for my barracks. That meant I had to be up at night, shovel coal into the furnace so that the whole barracks would be kept warm. Uh, there, one thing I recall specifically was at that time we had a Seder service for Passover. And guess who was leading the service? A comedian named Zero Mostel.
At Camp Ritchie.
Yeah. And he led the service. But I never went to any other service. Just the Passover Seder.
Do you remember if that service was held in the Camp Ritchie chapel?
No, it was held in a sort of a dining hall.
Oh, sure.
To accommodate a lot of fellow Jewish trainees.
Do you remember any of the other courses you took at Ritchie?
Well, one that suited me, but that was rather difficult, was field orientation. We were given a map with the center cut out. So there was a map with a big hole. They gave us a compass, this holy map, and sent us at night out into some fields with barbed wire, with creek or something, and took us out there in a truck and told us, find your way back by morning. At such and such a point, a truck will be waiting to take you back to camp. If you can't make it, too bad. So, with a compass and an incomplete map, I had to find my way back. It was a big adventure, and I did make it back.
No.
Yeah.
Did you knock on any houses or farmhouse doors and ask for directions?
Did you knock on any farmhouse doors and ask for directions?
Nobody asking for directions. Was completely uh, intuitive and compass reading.
So were you punished when you returned for not getting back on time?
I think he did.
What?
Were you punished for not getting back on time?
God, no.
Oh.
Because I made it back on time.
Do you remember any interesting characters that you had courses with at Ritchie?
Do you remember any interesting characters you had courses with at Ritchie?
I was, as most of my life, pretty much a loner, Loner. So I don't, in Cologne, I made a friend and I lost it because I was torn away to emigrate. And I don't think I made any attachment to anyone else in the army at Ritchie. Subsequently, I was always a loner, depending on myself.
Sure. So you finished up at Ritchie, and did you have an overseas assignment?
You finished up at Ritchie. Did you have an overseas assignment?
Uh, well, I have to go back a little bit. Part of the training that I didn't get resulted for the uh, graduates from Ritchie with pretty high grades, like staff sergeant, tech sergeant, because I never finished the complete course. I was left a PFC, bottom of the ladder. And I always held that against Banfield. Uh, for the rest of my service, I was mostly a PFC, a corporal, and it was not until about a month or two before I was discharged that I finally made T4, equivalent to a sergeant. But as far as assignment went, I got no assignment. I was put on a cattle ship, as they call the Liberty ship, in Brooklyn, New York, went across the ocean, the Atlantic, and for 1 month I stayed in Northern Ireland, where the weather was miserable. I was put on guard duty with a rifle without ammunition. That was a joke. Uh, Stayed along a loch, a big lake, walked up and down, heard the crows, caw, 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 and was relieved by the next person. From there, I was shipped to across the water to England, where I was assigned to a camp, uh, Norwich, and not Northwich, but Norwich. In they had sort of barracks, and it was a rappel depot, as we call them, replacement depot, where troops that were sent elsewhere were sort of kept in reserve. And one thing I remember, as a PFC, I was assigned to clean up the quarters of officers. So the lieutenants would throw their dirty linen and bed linen and what have you on the floor. And one of my jobs was to clean up after them as a low class PFC. my respect for those officers was way down just because they had a gold bar or a silver bar on their shoulders didn't mean anything.
Mm.
I held them in maximum low regard. And another thing that I learned about the Army was KP, kitchen work, kitchen patrol, KP. When you did not behave according to what the uh, sergeants felt was proper, you got KP. Well, that happened to me one time. I was in a food line and the food was not prepared properly. I got a potato that was hard, had not been properly cooked. So I put it aside and went through the line. And I was stopped by the kitchen sergeant, and he said, "You eat this." I said, "It's not cooked well." And he said, "You eat it, you're on KP." So that was my punishment to clean pots. That was to teach discipline. You do as I say, or else. You learn pretty quickly.
So you're on the ship and you're being served these hard potatoes. And where do you finally end up?
Where do you finally end up after North?
Okay, I was sent all over England for about 6 or 7 months. Oh, at one time we were told you are getting ready to be sent to the continent. Empty all your belongings, pictures, electric shaver, family, photographs, everything in a pile. Never saw it again. Never saw it again. Somebody had a good deal in doing this. But I found myself after about, oh, my parents had friends in England and they were in London. I never got to see them because London was under attack. The Blitz, German flyers. So I never went to visit them. But I might as well have gone because where I wound up later, I was subjected to the same kind of attack from the skies. But that was in England. Uh, I found myself in Southampton port on the southern coast. And when I got off the boat, which was another experience of being in a hammock at the very top of the layers of hammocks with guys around me playing cards, shouting, smoking. It was not allowed. And so I didn't get much of a rest on the trip across the channel. But when I got off the boat, I was in Normandy. And I was in Normandy just a few weeks after the landing and the battles on the beaches. And I was in a tent in a Normandy field with the mud all around. What was I to do there? I don't know. But before I got my time schedule mixed up and go back a little bit to England, where before I got on the boat to Normandy, there was one day I was in the hospital, which was a tent in a field, and I hear big noise. They told me, come. And I went out of the tent and I look up. The sky was full of planes from here to there. There was hardly an empty space. Planes after planes after planes with US markings, the star, and all of that. So, what I saw that time was the D-Day invasion, and I saw the start of the invasion. Instead of seeing the channel full of boats, I saw the sky full. So I found myself in Normandy and a muddy field and said, what is next? What am I doing here? And so I was detailed to a train that was supposed to take me God knows where. I remember I had to get rid of my electric shaver in that pile in England. So I had a razor, and we got to the locomotive where there was hot water from steam, took my helmet, filled it with hot water, and shaved in the field in Normandy as well as I could. Then I got on the train. The train consisted of cattle cars, and the final car had a sort of brakeman's house, uh, like a caboose. And I was used to seeing these trains, so I climbed up and instead of sitting in the cattle car, I sat up in the little caboose house on top, so I was able to see where we were going. And what I saw was the effects of US bombing of German transportation, because this was what was left of the German occupation. Destroyed cars, destroyed rails, destroyed yards. Everything was destroyed, but here we were in this one rail car on a track that had been quickly repaired by American Army Transportation Corps. So I was able to see not only the planes invading, I was following the troops that were advancing into battle. And where was I going in that train? Turns out to have been Paris. Never been to Paris. There was one officer, a captain, who knew my interest, and he said, I'm going to get you a ticket for a concert in Paris.
Hmm.
What was the concert? By a young woman violinist who was later killed in the accident, was playing Mendelssohn violin concerto, the first time a Jewish composer's music was played in Paris since the German occupation, when all Jewish music was banned. So this was quite an occasion. I didn't know Paris, never been there. So after the concert, I was in a suburb of Paris in a private home for maybe 1 or 2 nights. And then I was sent to what became the major focus of my existence, military existence in Europe, World War II. I was sent to Antwerp in Belgium. Antwerp was at that time a major uh, supply focus for the American army, which was by that time fighting to get into Germany. My assignment in Antwerp was to work with the local G2 or S2 intelligence officer located for that particular unit. He was a colonel. And I worked in that office. Number one, my job was to read the local newspapers, which were in Flemish, which was closely related to Dutch, which I spoke. I had to read those newspapers and see what comments were about the American local and general American troops. The Germans were occupiers, we were liberators, but we were all over Antwerp, all over Belgium. What was the local impression? And that was my job, to interpret articles about the American troops. Another job that was assigned to me Antwerp was under constant attack by German missiles, V1 and V2, so-called secret weapons. V1 you could hear brrr. When the little motor stopped, it plunged down and exploded on impact. The V2 is what the Ukrainians have to contend with now. It was sent on a ballistic course way up high, and then it came down without warning, exploded, and committed misery. Mm. Well, while I was in Antwerp, it was under constant attack by the V1 and V2. That was my personal acquaintance with war. Nothing much I could do. I was a sitting duck, so to speak. But one of my jobs in that office was to have a big wall map. And I had to pinpoint the location of the explosions so that somebody could retro the fly patterns backward to see where those V1s and V2s came from so that the originating point could be eliminated if possible. So that was my big contribution.
So it seems the photo analysis and map reading skills at Ritchie paid off.
It seems the map coordinating and photo interpretation paid off.
Yeah. Another job that was assigned to me was to interrogate not prisoners of war, but civilians. I only interrogated one prisoner of war, which was a joke because there was not much information to be gained. But I was to interrogate civilians who had been thought by their neighbors to have been collaborating with the Germans under the occupation. So I had to interrogate these people to make sure that if they applied for a job with the US Army or the Belgian, British Army, which was also in Antwerp, if any of these people had been collaborating with the Germans and then inform the higher up the chain whether these people were clean or dirty.
Do you think
it's difficult because sometimes people had a personal animus and just wanted to get even with a neighbor. And it was difficult to distinguish what was genuine and what was personal. Another job that I had there in Antwerp was Antwerp was surrounded by canals with barges trafficking in and out. Had to go to check the barges to see if there was any contraband, which meant interviewing the barge man. Another one was to go into the port of Antwerp to a ship and interview the captain to see the manifest and to see whether there was any contraband coming in on the ship. This was a joke. Here I was a PFC, although working with the intelligence in Antwerp, you never showed your rank. It was just a little US pin on your lapel. So whoever you dealt with had to deal with me as an unknown quantity of American army. Actually, what I learned from inspecting for contraband was not very much because my training by the officers in Antwerp how to go about getting a manifest from a captain and comparing the manifest with the actual load on the ship was a joke. What did I know? I didn't know what to look for. It was just by going by trust and by feel. So I thought my major contribution in the field of military intelligence consisted of interpreting newspapers, uh, interrogating civilians, plotting the path of the incoming bombs, and the big thing for me was being a sitting duck. I know there were Ritchie boys who were out in the field fighting the Germans, supplying information gained from prisoner interrogation to higher ups. But for me, the personal impact was sitting like a sitting duck under V1 and the V2. I always was wondering, is one of these things going to hit me?
Now, let me ask you, what was your feeling upon learning about VE Day?
What was your feeling when you learned of VE Day?
Hard to describe, but it's like rockets, peaceful rockets, exploding all over at one time. And then came an afterthought. Is the Pacific next? What are you going to do? So, but one of the highlights after VE Day was seeing Eisenhower in an open car driving through the city and seeing that, and then wondering who is Truman? Who is this guy who is following Roosevelt, the big hero? But my main thought was, is the Pacific next?
One
And then
thing,
I was promoted to T4. After all this low grade PFC corporal who didn't make it all the way through the class because Colonel Banfield wanted to push out team after team after team. Here was I, a low grade soldier, finally promoted T4. And that didn't last long because a month or two later, I was discharged.
now, one thing I neglected to ask you earlier was when you were at Camp Ritchie, did you gain your U.S. citizenship at that time?
He forgot to ask and wanted to know, when you were at Camp Ritchie, did you gain your U.S. citizenship?
Did I what?
Gain your U.S. citizenship.
Oh my God! How could I forget? At the citizenship was earlier, was part of during my basic training at Camp Croft. I was put into a car, a military car, driven to Spartanburg, just down the road an hour and a half. And in the federal district court, I was naturalized, gained my citizenship about 3 months maybe after I was drafted. I became a citizen. Yeah.
And how did it make you feel being a citizen of the United States?
Yeah. Highlight. Yeah.
So the war had ended. You were discharged, and where did you go? What did you do after the war? Did you seek a career? And obviously, you had a family.
uh, what did you do after the war, after you were discharged? Did you have a career? What of family?
After I was discharged, I first went to work in my parents' business. My mother, as I said, was a designer, and I worked in the business as secretary. And not long after I was discharged, and I got rid of my uniform in a hurry, I went to visit the wife of one of my officers to bring her greetings from that officer. When I met her, I learned that that marriage was on the rocks. And I got entranced with that lady. She's sitting over there.
Who is also 99. 2 days apart, they are.
Wow.
As the old fashioned expression goes, I courted her because we hit it off like this. And his loss was my gain. We've been married 71 years.
That's amazing.
We've known each other 77. And that's what I did after I was discharged. I didn't marry her right away. I courted her. We went for about 5 years before we got married. But uh, and while I was working in my parents' business, Carolyn, my wife, told me about the GI Bill of Rights, which I hadn't paid much attention to. The GI Bill of Rights entitled me to a big education. I enrolled at Columbia University in New York. I went to night school for several years until I had to tell my parents I have to leave the business because there are courses that are given in the daytime, and I must go to take those courses. So I quit the business, which was wrenching in a way, graduated with a bachelor's, went on to more courses, graduated with a master's degree, and Carolyn was at that time working at the Library of Columbia, and she told me, why don't you study or become a librarian? Because they need men. They're mostly women now, but they need men. So for my third degree, I got a master's in library science, library service. And so I became a librarian. And while I was still at Columbia, I had a sort of a PS, what do you call PSTD or
PSTD. PTSD, sorry.
yeah, I envisioned an explosion over 72nd Street and Broadway, which was a fear, I guess, of bombs coming down. And also, I was at sixes and sevens. So I went into psychotherapy to get rid of all of this junk. And I was joking at one time that I was burning the candle at both ends, actually, at three ends. I was studying at Columbia. I was taking psychotherapy to get clear and courting Carolyn at the same time.
And working.
Well, I made it through. I graduated from Columbia. I graduated from psychotherapy, and I'm still hooked up with Carolyn after 77 years.
It's phenomenal. Wow.
As one of my caregivers here told me, you're a survivor. And that's what I am.
In more ways than one.
Yeah.
Wow.
Is there anything else you want to know about Ritchie?
Well, I mean, if you have more to share, I'll have to
more to share.
I'll have to do the same thing and log off and
Mhm.
log back on because I'm almost out of time again on the video.
If you have more to share, he'll log off and log back on.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to add? How that time was for you or how it influenced the rest of your life?
Well, I thought with my intelligence work, when I was discharged about a month or two after, I thought I'd be able to use that experience as a profession. And I applied to the CIA and I applied to the State Department, but neither of those would take me. And I always thought that they might have a prejudice because I came from abroad instead of being native born. So I never had a chance there. But as it happened, I became a librarian. I worked at the Library of Congress and became an assistant chief of one of the divisions.
Wow.
I worked for the federal government in one capacity or another as a military and as a civilian for 30 years.
Wow.
At the age of 60, I quit, drew my pension for 39 years. I've been drawing a pension. Imagine 39 years in retirement. So what I learned at Ritchie maybe sharpened my wits, gave me an understanding of the military structure, the prejudices and routines that are burned into the system. And I'm glad I got out of it. But I'm not, but I'm glad that I had the experience, which I think made me a better person.
And well, it took a long time, but now the Ritchie boys have been honored in a number of ways. Last May, the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum gave them the Elie Wiesel Award, which is their highest honor. And oh, sorry.
It's okay. He said it's taken a while, but the Ritchie boys have been honored. And one thing I didn't know is that the U.S. Holocaust Museum have given the Ritchie boys the Elie Wiesel honor award.
Who is?
The U.S. Holocaust Museum
Oh.
honored the Ritchie boys with the Elie Wiesel honor award.
And also, the Ritchie boys have been nominated for a Congressional Gold Medal Award.
Oh my! Yeah, you heard that. You heard that.
So we're hoping that will pass through this year, and that's why for me it's such an honor to have conducted this interview with you and talked to someone who, in many, many, many regards, played such a large role in where we are today.
It's been a great honor for him to conduct the interview and sorry, I lost it.
To speak with you and to learn more about your life and
To learn more about your life, as this has been a part of it, as Ritchie has.
Yeah, a very big part.